The late 18th and early 19th centuries represented a period of dramatic transformation across the globe, an era defined by expanding maritime power and rapidly shifting economic tides. From the industrializing centers of Western Europe to the established empires stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to India, global trade networks were being fundamentally rewired. Yet, within this accelerating tapestry of commerce, one civilization stood apart. The Qing dynasty in China. China at this time was not merely an isolated entity. It was a massive, deeply sophisticated commercial power, possessing industries unmatched by any other nation, from porcelain and silk to tea and specialized metallurgy. The ruling imperial house, the Qing, had successfully maintained a profound degree of internal stability for much of its period of greatest strength, allowing Chinese society to flourish according to millennia-old traditions and established bureaucratic systems. This was an empire whose self-conception, internally and externally, was one of unparalleled cultural and civilizational supremacy. To the west, immense market presented both staggering opportunity and profound logistical challenge. European powers, Britain, France, the Netherlands, were intensely interested in accessing China's goods. However, their engagement was not uniform. The primary conduit through which foreign trade was managed was codified into a system known as the Canton system. The sheer volume of demand for Chinese commodities created an extraordinary imbalance. Western merchants desired tea, porcelain, and silks above all else. But what did they possess in return? While China required certain raw materials, like specialized medicinal herbs or metals, the flow of goods back to Europe was severely restricted by Qing imperial policy. The Canton system formalized this limitation. It concentrated nearly all foreign trade at the port of Guangzhou, managed exclusively through a designated group of Chinese merchants known as the Kohong, and subjected all foreign traders to strict regulations regarding residency, movement, and commercial activity. For the European mercantile houses, particularly those representing British interests, most notably following the rise of powerful chartered companies like the British East India Company, this system was deeply frustrating. The rigid structure meant that trade could not develop organically. It had to fit into a pre-approved imperial mechanism. Attempts by foreign traders to bypass these restrictions were met with formidable official resistance, upheld both by local officials and the established legal framework of the Qing government. The core tension, therefore, was one of systemic incompatibility. The Western world operated under an increasingly liberal, mercantilist economic model that prized free exchange and expanding markets. Meanwhile, the Qing system viewed international trade not as a means of mutual commercial growth, but rather as a tightly managed tributary relationship, a mechanism through which foreign goods could enter, while China maintained its sovereign control over its own economy and customs. As decades passed into the late 18th century, structural tension began to manifest in alarming economic consequences. The primary commodities that Western powers possessed in abundance relative to Chinese demand were often goods of relatively low intrinsic value to the Qing market, namely silver bullion from American mines or, increasingly, textiles sourced through trade routes originating further west. The persistent desire for Chinese tea and silks created a relentless drain on European capital, creating a massive systemic deficit that had to be paid in hard currency. To resolve this perilous balance of payments crisis, the commercial appetite shifted dramatically toward commodities that could generate immediate, substantial revenue, and by 1830, that commodity became opium. The introduction and subsequent proliferation of Indian-grown opium into Chinese markets represented not merely a trade adjustment, but an explosive disruption to the established economic equilibrium. This influx triggered a rapid crisis within the Qing state's fiscal health and social fabric. The resulting desperation and the profound psychological pressure placed upon the imperial administration, the desperate need for silver to offset the mounting deficit, set the stage for a clash of incompatible worldviews. The entrenched, regulated grandeur of the Chinese Empire confronting the relentless, profit-driven expansionism of emerging Western industrial powers. Historical imbalance was not merely an economic problem. It became a profound geopolitical flashpoint, the course for what would become known as the Opium Wars and, subsequently, the Century of Humiliation. To understand the conflagration that erupted in the Canton River Delta in the 1800s, one must first grasp the profound structural imbalance inherent to global trade during the early modern period. By the late 18th century, Britain found itself in a unique and deeply precarious economic position relative to the vast, ancient markets of China under the rule of the Qing dynasty. While British industry was undergoing an unprecedented burst of manufacturing power, fueled by innovations like the steam engine and the mechanized textile loom, the burgeoning mercantile class required commensurate outlets for its finished goods. China, conversely, possessed a civilization that had achieved extraordinary self-sufficiency. Its internal markets were immense, providing everything from porcelain to silk, but its external engagement was rigorously controlled. The Qing administration operated through a meticulously maintained system known as the Canton system. This system dictated that nearly all foreign trade with China, all goods and services exchanged, must be conducted exclusively through the port of Guangzhou or Canton. This arrangement served the imperial interests by maintaining strict control over customs, revenue, and limiting outside influence. European merchants who sought to buy Chinese luxuries faced a daunting economic hurdle. They were required to pay for their purchases, primarily in silver bullion, an outflow of specie that steadily drained Western treasuries. The commodities desired by the British, tea, silk, porcelain, were intoxicatingly valuable, but the cost was staggering. The resulting trade deficit became a persistent and escalating drain on British wealth. Britain had little that China currently coveted enough to warrant payment in vast quantities of silver. Economic dilemma placed immense pressure upon London's powerful merchant houses, whose profits were directly tied to Asian commerce. The balance sheet, as historians calculate it, was dangerously tilted. The solution, or perhaps the desperation measure, arrived in the form of opium. Opium, cultivated initially by British planters operating primarily in India, an acquisition formalized after decades of Anglo-Indian military and economic dominance, found an unforeseen and devastating market in China. It was a commodity that bypassed traditional trade restrictions and addressed the core imbalance. It was highly addictive, relatively easy to transport, and crucially, it could be traded for silver, which the British merchants then used to purchase Chinese tea and silk. This pivot from legitimate goods to narcotics represents the single most corrosive economic decision of the period. The flow of opium into Chinese ports like Guangzhou did not represent a minor illicit trade. Rather, it became an organized, massive commercial enterprise managed by powerful British firms and agents. It was the mechanism that began systematically reversing the flow of silver bullion out of China. The Qing authorities, keenly aware of the insidious economic threat posed by this drug epidemic, a threat compounded by the sheer volume of opium entering the market, responded with increasing alarm. The government's attempts to curb the trade were not merely moral protests. They were calculated actions designed to preserve the stability and fiscal integrity of the empire. By the 1830 odd years, repeated efforts by officials, notably Commissioner Lin Zexu, to confiscate and destroy stockpiles of opium demonstrated a profound commitment to protecting the nation's economic bedrock from foreign commercial exploitation. For the British merchants, however, this resistance was interpreted not as an act of sovereign defense, but as an intolerable obstruction to established profitable commerce. Their commercial imperative, the need for guaranteed market access, the right to trade freely, and above all, the ability to service their massive debt obligations, overrode any respect for international law or Chinese sovereignty. The tension built steadily over years of failed diplomatic negotiation and escalating economic friction. The British government began to view China not as a sovereign nation whose laws must be respected, but as an enormous, lucrative market that required opening through the application of overwhelming commercial and military force. This deep-seated belief, the doctrine of the indispensable British market imperative, set the stage for confrontation, leading directly to the diplomatic breakdown and the eventual armed conflict that would fundamentally reshape China's relationship with the Western world. The decades preceding the conflict were defined by a profound and increasingly destabilizing economic imbalance. For centuries, China, under the expansive governance of the Qing dynasty, had maintained an extraordinary global commercial power, yet its wealth was primarily acquired through trade commodities that reflected deeply ingrained cultural preferences. The European powers, particularly Great Britain, harbored a voracious appetite for Chinese goods, tea, silks, and porcelain. These items were not merely luxury articles, they were fundamental components of the material culture of the British Empire, fueling domestic consumption and supporting vast mercantile networks. However, this trade relationship was fundamentally asymmetrical. The metallic currency that China demanded in exchange, silver bullion, was draining British coffers at an unsustainable rate. For much of the late 18th century, Britain struggled to find a commodity that Chinese officials would accept as equivalent value for their coveted goods. The Canton system, which strictly governed foreign trade through the port of Guangzhou, was designed precisely to manage this imbalance, limiting Western interaction and ensuring imperial control over commerce. The solution, commercially speaking, proved deeply controversial. It emerged in the form of opium, a highly addictive narcotic cultivated primarily in British India. By systematically flooding the Chinese market with this commodity, the trade dynamics were violently inverted. The silver that had been draining out of Britain was now counterbalanced by a new stream of revenue derived from the sale of narcotics. This illicit trade became an immensely powerful engine for profit, but one that fundamentally undermined the Qing dynasty's social and fiscal stability. By the 1830s, the sheer volume of opium entering China had created a devastating addiction crisis, eroding public health and corrupting institutional integrity. The economic system was now predicated upon this destructive commodity. Unprecedented commercial power imbalance brought the two civilizations into an inevitable collision, a confrontation not merely over trade tariffs or legal jurisdiction, but over the very nature of sovereignty and international law itself. The diplomatic friction reached a critical point in the late 1830s. The Qing court viewed foreign encroachment with deep suspicion, interpreting Western commercial activities as attempts to undermine imperial authority. Simultaneously, British mercantile interests, now increasingly represented by private traders rather than solely through chartered companies, demanded unfettered access and legal recourse for their citizens operating within Chinese waters. The flashpoint arrived in 1839. the Qing government, under the irresolute leadership of officials like Lin Zexu, perceived the opium trade as an existential threat to the integrity of the empire. Despite decades of diplomatic negotiations mediated by foreign consular representatives, these efforts proved inadequate against the relentless flow of contraband. The decision taken by Commissioner Lin Zexu was a monumental assertion of imperial authority. In June 1839, he spearheaded a massive naval operation that resulted in the seizure and destruction of thousands of chests of opium at Human, near Guangzhou. This act, viewed from Beijing as an absolute necessity to protect public health and maintain fiscal stability, was interpreted by the British foreign community not merely as a legal enforcement action, but as a profound violation of treaty rights and commercial freedom. The response from Great Britain was immediate and uncompromising. The seizure of the commodity provided the necessary pretext, a diplomatic casus belli, that allowed Parliament to authorize military intervention. What had begun as an economic dispute over legality and trade volume rapidly escalated into a geopolitical confrontation, marking the definitive end of the Canton system's protective barriers and initiating what would become known in British records as the First Opium War. The year 1840 thus stands not merely as a date on a ledger, but as the pivotal moment when commercial ambition collided irrevocably with imperial sovereignty. The year 1839 marked a profound inflection point in global history, a moment when established systems of trade and sovereignty collided violently with the burgeoning technologies of industrial capitalism. The conflict, which historians now recognize as the First Opium War, was not merely an exchange of goods. It was a brutal collision between two radically different worldviews, one rooted in centuries of regulated imperial tradition, and another predicated on the absolute global reach of steam power and industrialized weaponry. The geopolitical tension had been building for decades. The Qing dynasty, by the early 19th century, maintained a highly structured system of foreign trade, largely controlled through the Kong Merchant Guild centered in Guangzhou. This system, while effective in regulating commerce, proved utterly inadequate to withstand the relentless economic pressures exerted by Great Britain and its partners. For the British mercantile elite, the imbalance was unsustainable. The demand for Chinese porcelain, silk, tea, and spices far outstripped the value of what could be exchanged for them, creating a massive trade deficit that only the systematic importation of opium, a commodity grown primarily in British India, could temporarily balance. When diplomacy failed, military confrontation became inevitable. The fundamental disparity between the combatants was technological. On one side stood the Qing imperial forces and their allied merchant vessels, relying on traditional wooden junks, skilled navigators, and established defensive coastal artillery. These were formidable structures built over centuries of maritime experience. On the other side materialized the modern naval power of the Western nations, specifically the Royal Navy and private British steam-powered merchantmen. The advent of ironclads, rifled cannons, and paddle-wheel steamers fundamentally altered the calculus of warfare. A traditional wooden junk, no matter how expertly manned or constructed, was vulnerable to the concentrated firepower delivered by modern artillery. The speed and maneuverability afforded by steam engines meant that battles could be fought on terms entirely unfamiliar to Chinese naval commanders. The ensuing naval engagements along the Pearl River estuary were characterized less by grand set peace battles and more by a relentless attrition of technological disparity. When Commodore Matthew Elliott's forces, backed by superior Western weaponry, arrived in the Guangzhou area, they encountered not merely resistance, but an institutional inability to match the industrialized assault. The Qing authorities viewed these actions as illegal incursions into sovereign waters. The Western powers viewed them through the lens of international commercial rights and perceived necessity. The strategic objectives were clear: open China's vast internal market and dismantle its existing trade restrictions. The resulting military pressure culminated in the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, which marked a catastrophic turning point for Chinese sovereignty. This treaty did not merely resolve a trade dispute, it fundamentally redrew the geopolitical map of coastal China. The most enduring legacy of this conflict was the establishment of the treaty ports. Cities such as Shanghai and Canton were transformed into semi-autonomous zones, places where foreign powers could conduct trade, reside, and operate with significantly reduced Qing oversight. These ports became controlled enclaves, governed by unequal treaties that granted extraterritorial rights to Western nationals, effectively placing them outside the direct jurisdiction of Chinese law. This system was not merely an economic agreement, it represented a profound shift in the balance of power, a forced concession from the imperial court that signaled the beginning of what would become known as the Century of Humiliation. The Opium Wars demonstrated that while the Qing dynasty possessed immense human capital, deep cultural traditions, and formidable military history, these assets could not compensate for the revolutionary leaps in industrial naval technology. They proved that a nation's sovereignty, by the mid-19th century, was inextricably linked to its ability to engage with and resist the mechanisms of modern global commerce. The conclusion of armed hostilities did not bring peace, it ushered in a complex and often deeply destabilizing era of enforced renegotiation. The military victories achieved by foreign powers, particularly Great Britain and later France, were not merely markers on a battlefield, they were instruments used to dismantle centuries-old economic sovereignty and reshape the geopolitical landscape of China. The ensuing period is best understood through the lens of international law, or rather, application thereof, and the deeply flawed mechanisms of treaty negotiation. The primary objective for the foreign powers was not simply territorial acquisition in the modern sense, but access to Chinese markets, access to trade routes, and critically, access to legal jurisdiction over their own citizens operating within China's borders. The treaties that followed the First Opium War, culminating most notably in the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, represent a watershed moment in modern global history, a paradigm shift from tributary relationships to forced treaty ports. The implications of these agreements were profound and immediately destabilizing. For the Chinese Qing dynasty court, which had historically viewed itself as the undisputed center of civilization, the imposition of such terms was an unprecedented humiliation. The treaties did not merely regulate trade, they dictated internal governance, opened specific coastal cities such as Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Ningbo to foreign mercantile activity, and most distressingly, granted extraterritoriality to foreign nationals. Extraterritoriality, in practical terms, meant that any crime committed by a British subject, for instance, within Chinese territory was judged under British law by British officials, effectively placing those individuals outside the jurisdiction of Qing legal authority. This diplomatic mechanism profoundly undermined the perceived integrity and power of the centralized state apparatus, to signal to both its own populace and the international community that China's sovereign laws were conditional and negotiable based on foreign military strength. Economically, the consequences were equally dire. The treaties formalized a system where Chinese tariffs and customs duties were systematically restricted or fixed at rates deemed acceptable, a by Western powers, rates far lower than what the Qing government considered necessary to protect burgeoning domestic industries, created an inherent structural imbalance in trade relations, benefiting foreign industrial goods while limiting China's ability to generate revenue through its own sovereign economic policy. The legal framework of these unequal treaties became a blueprint for subsequent international interaction with China throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The process was characterized by great asymmetry. The signatories were sophisticated Western industrial powers utilizing advancements in naval technology, global capitalism, and modern diplomatic law. The negotiating party was a vast, ancient empire grappling with internal political strains, economic stress, and the sudden shock of industrialized military force. This environment fostered deep psychological tension within the ruling elite. Faced with blatant breaches of established international norms, the requirement to open ports that had historically been closed, the acceptance of foreign judicial supremacy, many Qing officials struggled to reconcile traditional Confucian concepts of self-sufficiency and centralized authority with the stark reality of global industrial power. The dilemma was one of survival. How could a millennia-old civilization maintain its core identity and sovereign integrity when its legal borders were defined by treaties signed under duress? The consequence, as this chapter reveals, was not merely an economic downturn or a diplomatic disagreement. It represented a fundamental fracture in the perceived structure of Chinese sovereignty. It initiated a century where internal reform movements, ranging from self-strengthening efforts to revolutionary revolutions, were constantly battling against the systemic constraints imposed by foreign treaties and the pervasive need for external validation that undermined true, independent national development. The stage was thus set not merely for economic struggle, but for an existential confrontation with the nature of modern international power itself. The tensions that had bled China dry in the years following 1842 did not simply dissipate, they merely gathered their force, transforming into a more complex, multipolar geopolitical crucible. The initial conflict with Great Britain, though bloody and economically devastating for the Qing dynasty, dismantled the imperial structure entirely. Instead, it opened fissures, economic, diplomatic, and militaristic, that foreign powers were quick to exploit. When the second major clash erupted in 1856, historians often refer to it as the Second Opium War, yet its true nature was far more intricate, a collision of competing European imperial ambitions against the immense resilience, but also inherent vulnerabilities of the Qing state. By the mid-century, the global balance of power had shifted dramatically. Industrial revolutions in Europe and North America were creating an insatiable demand for raw materials and captive markets, a dynamic that China, despite its monumental civilization, could not resist to the encroaching tide of Western economic might. Britain remained the chief proponent of opening Chinese trade, primarily through the continued enforcement of treaty ports established after the First War. But this time the intervention was no longer solely British. France arrived with renewed zeal, driven by a combination of cultural mission and commercial interest, viewing China as an arena for French global prestige. The immediate catalyst for the 1856 conflict involved escalating tensions over diplomatic protocol and perceived slights. The Qing court viewed the increasing foreign presence, particularly in treaty ports like Canton, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, as an intolerable encroachment upon sovereign dignity. From their perspective, powers were violating fundamental Chinese principles of tributary diplomacy. Conversely, from the European viewpoint, China was increasingly seen not as a civilized empire, but as a vast market that required modernizing governance to facilitate trade relations with industrialized nations. The true flashpoint, however, lay in international diplomatic maneuvering rather than solely military skirmishes. The mutual interests and occasionally conflicting agendas of Britain and France quickly intersected within the Chinese political landscape. This period saw an unprecedented level of coordinated, yet often competitive, foreign intervention. When hostilities did break out, initially involving punitive actions against missionary activities and trade violations, the conflict rapidly expanded beyond mere commercial disputes into a full-scale demonstration of global power projection. The military action that followed was characterized by technological asymmetry. European forces utilized steam, powered vessels, advanced artillery, and disciplined infantry formations, giving them overwhelming tactical advantages over the traditional Qing armies. The battles were fought not just for territory, but for diplomatic recognition and economic control. The Chinese resistance, while demonstrating profound bravery and strategic depth, struggled against the sheer industrial might marshaled by a coalition of Western powers. The outcome was sealed through negotiation rather than utter annihilation. The subsequent treaties, most notably the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and the Convention of Peking in 1860, represented a profound restructuring of China's relationship with the outside world. These agreements fundamentally altered Chinese sovereignty by formalizing foreign rights to missionary activity, opening more treaty ports along the Yangtze River, and granting unprecedented extraterritorial legal jurisdiction to Western nationals within China. This was not merely another conflict, it marked a decisive shift in geopolitical architecture. The Qing dynasty was forced into an increasingly constrained role on the world stage, a state whose internal autonomy was systematically eroded by external treaties that prioritized foreign commercial access over national self-determination. These arrangements established precedents of international legal imbalance that would define China's experience for the next century, initiating what many scholars now term the Century of Humiliation. The confluence of European industrial might, imperial ambition, and Chinese defensive resistance created a volatile mix, a geopolitical chessboard, where the rules were written by the victors, leaving the Qing Empire grappling with an unprecedented challenge to its traditional role as the self-contained center of global civilization. The initial shockwaves of the Opium Wars, the forced treaties of Nanjing in 1842 and subsequent agreements, did not simply dismantle Qing sovereignty. They initiated a profound, agonizing intellectual and institutional crisis within the heart of imperial China. The humiliation was palpable, manifest in the loss of tariff autonomy, the opening of treaty ports like Shanghai and Guangzhou, and the concession of extraterritorial rights to foreign powers. For the ruling Manchu elite, this forced encounter with Western industrial might represented a fundamental contradiction. How could an empire built on millennia of tributary order be undone by maritime commerce and advanced weaponry? The initial response was often characterized by deep confusion, even fatalism. Many Qing officials clung stubbornly to the traditional Confucian worldview, viewing foreign encroachment not as a challenge to their economic model, but as a moral transgression requiring reaffirmation of China's inherent cultural superiority. The solution, in this view, was not military modernization or treaty renegotiation, but rather spiritual and scholarly purification. However, the material realities demanded practical change. By the 1860s, recognizing that mere philosophical defiance would fail against steamships and rifled artillery, a crucial shift began: the self-strengthening movement. This was not a unified revolution of ideology, but rather a pragmatic, often fragmented industrial push initiated by powerful regional figures, most notably Li Hongzhang in Jiangsu and Zhang Zhedong in Jiangxi. The core tenet of this movement can be summarized by the phrase, Chinese learning for essence, Western science for practical use. The goal was explicitly defensive, to acquire military technology, build arsenals, establish modern shipyards, and train an educated class capable of managing industrial infrastructure. They sought foreign expertise, British engineers, French naval architects, German weaponry specialists, not to adopt Western political structures wholesale, but merely to fill the technological gap that had been brutally exposed by the imperial defeats. The results were mixed, characterized by impressive, yet ultimately limited, successes. The Beiyang fleet, for instance, became a formidable modern force in its time, demonstrating China's capacity for large-scale industrial mobilization. Railways crisscrossed key economic arteries. Telegraph lines connected coastal cities that had previously been isolated. These achievements proved to the world, and perhaps more importantly to the Qing court itself, that modernization was possible. Yet, the self-strengthening movement faced structural obstacles, almost insurmountable in scale. The reforms were perpetually undermined by two forces: entrenched resistance from conservative elements within the bureaucracy who viewed foreign technology as a threat to traditional social order, and critically, by the very geopolitical system they sought to navigate, the unequal treaties themselves. These agreements fundamentally constrained China's ability to raise capital or reform its own tariff structure without explicit foreign concession. By the 1890s, the realization dawned that mere military parity was insufficient. The challenge transcended arsenals and shipyards. It demanded a comprehensive overhaul of the social contract, a complete re-evaluation of the relationship between the ruling elite, the burgeoning merchant class, and the peasantry. This intellectual reckoning culminated in the 100 Days reforms of 1898, spearheaded by figures like Yuan Shikai and championed by certain reformist intellectuals within the court. The reforms were radical in scope. They proposed abolishing local autonomy in favor of a centralized, modern bureaucracy, drafting new constitutional frameworks, and even suggesting changes to the imperial title itself. They represented perhaps the most profound attempt since the Tang dynasty to fundamentally restructure Chinese governance for the modern age. But this period demonstrates the agonizing dilemma of Qing leadership. The reforms were always reactive, piecemeal, and often aborted by internal political maneuvering or sudden shifts in foreign power dynamics. The very success of the self-strengthening efforts, the massive expenditure of capital and manpower, ultimately drained the imperial treasury, creating a deep fiscal vulnerability that external powers were quick to exploit. As we move into the final decades of the dynasty, pattern becomes tragically clear. Internal reform movements possessed immense intellectual vigor and practical capacity, yet they remained structurally constrained by an over-reliance on foreign capital, limited by crippling treaty obligations, and perpetually undermined by factional conflict within the imperial structure itself. The confluence of technological disparity, economic dependency, and ideological paralysis set the stage for a profound national crisis that would reshape East Asia forever. The period following the military conflicts of the 1840s through the late 19th century did not conclude with a simple restoration of stability. Rather, it inaugurated a profound, systemic restructuring of China's relationship with the global powers. The mechanisms of this change were enshrined in an escalating network of treaties. Treaties that, viewed through the lens of international law and geopolitical power dynamics, cemented what historians term the Century of Humiliation. These documents were not merely agreements, they were instruments of penetration, defining spheres of influence and establishing unprecedented levels of foreign legal immunity within Chinese territory. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, following the First Opium War, set the foundational precedent that China's sovereignty was subject to negotiation by external powers operating outside the traditional tributary system. the immediate consequences were tangible and revolutionary for Qing law. The cession of Hong Kong Island to Great Britain represented a permanent withdrawal of sovereign control over valuable territory. More critically, the treaty mandated the opening of 5 major port cities, Canton, Amoy, Fukao, Ningpo, and Shanghai, to unrestricted foreign trade. These ports became treaty ports, areas where Chinese law was routinely bypassed in favor of foreign commercial convenience. The subsequent treaties deepened this erosion. The Treaty of Tientsin, signed in 1858 after the Second Opium War, expanded these concessions dramatically. It not only legalized the opium trade, a catastrophic economic and social drain, but also permitted Christian missionaries and other foreigners to travel inland into previously restricted areas, reaching deep into the heartland of China. The treaty effectively dismantled centuries of deeply entrenched geopolitical isolationism. Perhaps the most legally corrosive element introduced by this system was the doctrine of extraterritoriality. This legal principle stipulated that foreign nationals within Chinese ports, be they British subjects, French citizens, or Americans, were immune from Chinese jurisdiction. If a dispute arose between a foreign resident and a local Chinese citizen, the law of the foreign power would govern the trial, and the accused could only be tried by their own consulate officials. This was not merely a diplomatic inconvenience, it represented an explicit, legally recognized nullification of Qing judicial authority over its own people within its own borders. The state apparatus, the very mechanism of governance, had been systematically undermined from within by international legal fiat. As the 19th century progressed, this treaty system evolved into a fragmented mosaic known as spheres of influence. This concept described a geopolitical reality where major powers, Britain in India and Southeast Asia, in Indochina, Russia along its northern borders, and Japan increasingly in Korea, effectively carved out exclusive zones of economic and political control. While formal annexation was rare until the 20th century, the practical effect was the same. Chinese policy decisions, infrastructural development, and even resource extraction were dictated by foreign powers operating under treaty mandates. Economic penetration followed this geopolitical carving up. Foreign concessions rapidly materialized within major cities like Shanghai and Tianjin. These concessions were not merely commercial districts, they were semi-autonomous zones where Western architectural styles, laws, and economic practices superseded traditional Chinese life. Railways, once symbols of modern industrial power globally, were built across China, but crucially, the financing, control, and operational ownership remained overwhelmingly foreign. When the British built railways in Yunnan province, for example, the profits flowed back to London. When French investors established infrastructure in Vietnam, they effectively created a colonial economic pipeline. The psychological weight of this system cannot be overstated. For Chinese intellectual life, the treaties represented an unbearable paradox: modernization coupled with enforced subjugation. The dilemma was acute. To adopt Western industrial and legal technologies necessary for survival meant accepting legal limitations on national sovereignty. The Qing court struggled to reconcile its deeply ingrained Confucian sense of universal imperial authority with a new international order that treated China as merely another market rather than a sovereign civilization. By the turn of the century, the treaty system had transformed global trade into an extractive mechanism. It allowed foreign powers not just to sell goods or services, but to control the very mechanisms of Chinese economic life, from banking and mining rights to port customs duties. The legal framework established in Nanjing and Tientsin ensured that China entered the 20th century deeply indebted economically partitioned, and legally compromised, laying bare the systemic vulnerability that would define its trajectory for decades to come. The late 19th century marked a period of profound intellectual and geopolitical upheaval within China, a society reeling from successive incursions that had irrevocably altered its traditional understanding of sovereignty. Trauma inflicted by the Opium Wars did not end with treaty signings. Rather, it metastasized into a deep-seated crisis of national identity and governmental legitimacy. The foundational conflict became one between the Qing dynasty's entrenched imperial structure and the burgeoning forces of modern nationalism, internal and external. By the 1890s, China was no longer merely an object of foreign trade interest. It had become a complex battleground for global ambitions, a zone segmented by spheres of influence defined by great powers, Japan, Russia, Britain, France, and Germany. The initial response to humiliation, however, was not unified resistance, but rather fragmentation. The collapse of central Qing authority coincided with the rise of powerful regional military factions. This era saw a proliferation of semi-autonomous warlord regimes, most notably the Beiyang Army in Beijing, whose loyalty was often dictated by immediate survival and personal ambition, rather than adherence to imperial doctrine. Internal power struggles severely hampered any cohesive national defense strategy against foreign encroachment. The intellectual response to this crisis proved equally potent. The sheer scale of external pressure forced a critical reckoning within Chinese academia and political thought. Intellectuals observed the industrial might of the West, the steamship, the telegraph, the modern artillery, and recognized that China's traditional tributary system was wholly inadequate for navigating the emerging global order. This realization fueled two distinct but interacting movements: self-strengthening and radical revolutionary nationalism. The self-strengthening movement, roughly from the 1860s to the 1890s, represented an attempt by elements within the Qing administration to adopt foreign military technology and industrial methods, shipyards, arsenals, railways, while theoretically preserving traditional Confucian political structures. While these efforts yielded some tangible modern infrastructure, they were fundamentally hampered by systemic corruption, bureaucratic inertia, internal resistance from conservative elements who viewed Westernization as a threat to Chinese culture itself. Yet, the seeds of true radicalism were sown concurrently. Figures like Sun Yat-sen emerged during this period, articulating a political vision that transcended merely strengthening existing institutions. His concept of the three principles of the people, nationalism, democracy, and livelihood, represented an unprecedented rejection of dynastic rule and a direct appeal to popular sovereignty. The geopolitical flashpoint that dramatically accelerated China's internal collapse was the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895. The conflict, initially fought over influence in Korea, exposed Qing military weaknesses catastrophically. Following the Treaty of Shimonoseki, the Qing dynasty was compelled to cede Taiwan and make significant territorial concessions, marking a profound humiliation that fueled intense resentment both at home and among international observers. The subsequent decades saw escalating attempts by various factions, from reformists within the court to revolutionary societies in Shanghai and Guangzhou, to seize control of China's destiny. The 1911 revolution, which finally culminated in the abdication of the Qing emperor, was not a sudden event, but the violent culmination of these years of mounting economic distress, military weakness, and intellectual ferment. The period following 1912 did not usher in immediate stability. Instead, it ushered in the tumultuous warlord era, characterized by decades of localized conflict, foreign intervention, and political instability that crippled China's ability to consolidate a unified modern state. It was only through the crucible of these failures, the loss of sovereignty, the fragmentation of power, and the emergence of revolutionary ideologies fueled by deep national trauma, that the Chinese consciousness crystallized its singular, unyielding demand, genuine, sovereign autonomy in the modern international system. Profound quest for self-determination would define China's trajectory into the 20th century and beyond. Yet, to understand the China of today, one must first grasp the sheer weight of what was lost in those decades. A wound that did not merely scar the state, but fundamentally altered its global perception and internal psychological landscape. The Opium Wars, for all their tactical military brevity, were nothing compared to the enduring geopolitical shockwave they unleashed. They marked a profound discontinuity in China's history, shattering centuries of perceived self-sufficiency and isolation. The treaties signed following those conflicts, the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842, followed by others specifying trade rights and extraterritoriality, were not merely legal documents. They were architectural plans for external control. They institutionalized the concept of treaty ports, effectively carving up China's economic geography into zones governed by foreign commercial interests. Shanghai, Guangzhou, Tianjin, these cities became nodes in a global spiderweb where Chinese sovereignty was circumscribed by international law written by Western powers. The flow of goods, capital, and ideas was no longer dictated solely by the imperial court or traditional tributary relationships. It flowed through foreign treaty mechanisms, bypassing native institutions entirely. The initial reaction to this profound economic penetration, the constant drain of silver specie needed to balance trade deficits, the forced opening of internal markets, was a desperate attempt at modernization. This effort crystallized in what historians term the self-strengthening movement during the latter half of the 19th century. The Qing dynasty recognized that military and industrial parity was paramount for survival. They established arsenals, adopted Western weaponry, and attempted to build modern naval fleets. Yet, this endeavor was plagued by fundamental contradictions, a deep tension between adopting foreign technology while fiercely maintaining traditional Confucian social structures and political authority. The resulting institutions were often piecemeal, localized efforts, military factories here, telegraph lines there, but they lacked the centralized, cohesive national industrial vision required to challenge global maritime powers like Great Britain or France. The subsequent decades saw this internal struggle exacerbated by external imperial ambition. As Western powers consolidated their commercial and political foothold, other regional empires arrived, claiming spheres of influence. India, already under British paramountcy, exerted its gravitational pull. Japan, having undergone its own rapid modernization following the Meiji Restoration, emerged as a formidable challenger in East Asia. This geopolitical reality forced China into an increasingly constrained position where internal dissent, from revolutionary movements like the Taiping Rebellion to the anti-foreign resistance of the Boxer era, was often exploited or suppressed by foreign military presence, furthering the perception that Chinese destiny was contingent upon the goodwill of external powers. The trauma accumulated across these decades constituted a deep historical memory, the memory of perceived humiliation. This memory became an integral component of modern Chinese national consciousness. It is not simply a recollection of lost battles, it is the internalization of systemic weakness, a narrative that suggests that the nation's true sovereignty and strength were systematically undermined by foreign intervention, economic exploitation, and political fragmentation. When analyzing this historical arc from the late Qing period through to the early 21st century, one must observe a clear cause and effect chain. External pressure led to internal weakness, Internal weakness allowed for further external penetration. Continued humiliation fueled a powerful intellectual and political demand for national rejuvenation. The failure of traditional imperial structures to adapt to industrial capitalism, coupled with the experience of forced treaty agreements, created an enduring imperative within certain segments of Chinese society, a mandate that sovereignty must be absolute, self-determined, and impenetrable. Historical narrative, therefore, does not simply conclude with the passage of time, fundamentally shapes the political objectives of the modern state itself. The concept of a unified, powerful China capable of resisting external interference becomes less an abstract ideal and more a core pillar of national policy. It is the enduring legacy of that century of humiliation, a constant political gravitational pull towards centralized authority, rapid industrialization, and the absolute reassertion of China's place as a major global power, free from the perceived constraints of historical foreign control. The narrative arc moves from vulnerability to an almost existential necessity for national resurgence, defining much of contemporary Chinese geopolitical action.